We often talk about deep neck flexors, that many problems are associated with them, that they are prone to shortening, to excessive tension, and they compensate for the weakness of long neck flexors. And their tension is associated with both vertebral artery syndrome and pain in the occipital region, headaches and pain, as well as compression of the anterior and posterior occipital nerve with suboccipital nerve. What does this group of muscles, the deep neck flexors, represent after all? These are a few muscles. The deep neck flexors consist of the rectus capitis, anterior and posterior, and the obliquus capitis, superior and inferior. The rectus capitis anterior is located between the transverse process of the second cervical vertebra and the occipital bone, while the rectus capitis posterior is located slightly above between the first cervical vertebra and the occipital bone, and the obliquus capitis, superior and inferior. The inferior one is between the same mastoid process of the second cervical vertebra and the transverse process of the first cervical vertebra. And the superior one, between the transverse process of the first cervical vertebra and the mastoid bone. And together they form a group of deep neck flexors. But they are not that deep. Here we have reproduced their natural size, made a reconstruction of all these muscles, and they form such a network here. How are they positioned? Here it is. To the side, here it is. This is the inferior one. All these are not called neck muscles, but head muscles. This is the inferior one. Here is the transverse process, and it connects them. And the superior one, here is the mastoid bone and the first cervical vertebra. As you can see, they are actually quite long. Same here with these muscles, the rectus capitis. Here is the anterior one. Between the transverse process of the second cervical vertebra, and here's the posterior one. And what happens when they spasm, when they are shortened? Here, several structures are compressed at once. In this place, between the rectus capitis anterior and obliquus capitis superior, essentially right there, in this gap is the occipital nerve. The occipital nerve comes out here, and due to their shortening, due to the spasm of these muscles, its compression occurs. The nerve is compressed and thus will cause pain, specifically in the occipital region, like headaches in the occipital area. Here we also have the vertebral artery, and it too spasms. The compression of the rectus capitis posterior and obliquus capitis inferior causes the compression of the vertebral artery. Also, when these muscles are strained, movement will be limited in the joint between the first and second cervical vertebrae. That is, normally, due to the contraction of these muscles, rotation occurs. The movement of rotation occurs because the first vertebra, it turns on side of the second vertebra, it twists from one side to the other. In this movement, these obliquus capitis muscles are involved. Here is the second vertebra. This is the view from the front right here. Here is the spikes of the second vertebra. Here it goes, straight from the second vertebra right here. And between this spike and the inner surface on the first vertebra, there is such a joint. And this rotation of the first vertebra around the second, it is carried out due to the movement in this joint, between this protrusion. The joint surface on the first cervical vertebra. Here is all this group of muscles. Deep neck flexors are essentially, if we look at the attachment points and see that, for example, these superior and inferior oblique muscles, Their main function is to move the first cervical vertebra relative to the second. That is, this rotation, this is movement in the joint between the first vertebra and the spike of the second vertebra. And these two muscles, rectus capitis, anterior and posterior, they are already participating to some extent as flexors. So it turns out that when the long flexors of the neck do not work, these deep flexors start to kick in. Instead of their usual movement, this rotation, the rotation of the first cervical vertebra relative to the second, these oblique muscles begin to engage in holding the head. And in doing so, they begin to pinch the suboccipital nerve, and there is additional compression of the vertebral artery itself. And a block occurs in the joint between the first vertebra and the occipital bone due to the spasm of all these muscles. In essence, the same thing happens as with the imbalance of any other muscle groups. When some muscles stop working, other muscles take over their function. The same thing happens with the long neck flexors. When they are not working, the deep neck flexors start to participate instead. And first and foremost, as we see from the structure of all these muscles, the movement between the first and second vertebrae and between the first vertebrae and the occipital bone suffers. These joints stop moving fully due to the spasm of those muscles that should participate specifically in their movement. That is, they should move these joints. And because this happens, because there is a muscle spasm, there is a limitation of mobility in the joints between the first and second vertebrae, between the first vertebrae and the occipital bone. Firstly, there is a mechanical compression of the vertebral artery, the anterior occipital nerve, the posterior occipital nerve, the suboccipital nerve. That's how many structures are already here. That is, all these three nerves, when compressed, they cause pain. The suboccipital nerve exits between the rectus capitis anterior and obliques capitis superior. As for the anterior and posterior occipital nerves, they exit in the gap between the first and second cervical vertebrae. That is, the suboccipital nerve itself is between the occipital bone and the first cervical vertebra. Here, the obliquus capitis inferior and the anterior and posterior muscles can participate in its compression. And the anterior and posterior occipital nerves exit between the first and second cervical vertebrae, and the obliquus capitis inferior and part of the long flexors of the neck, which pass nearby, already participate in its compression, about which we will figure out later, not as a group of long flexors, but all together. And also, it seems to me, if you think about it, there can be a disbalance between these muscles themselves. That is, if we see here, right now I have recreated their sizes of these muscles on such a model, and I see now that they are not so short, and they are called deep flexors of the neck, but that's because they are relative to the long flexors of the neck. But otherwise, you see it's quite an anterior muscle. And here we, I think, can also encounter such a problem that when, for example, one oblique muscle turns off, there will be a shortening of the other oblique muscle. That is, there should also be a balance between them. And here we can encounter the fact that, for example, when the obliques capitis inferior isn't working, there may be a shortening of the posterior muscle, and vice versa. The same can be true for the rectus capitis. There should be a balance between the right and the left, and between the anterior and the posterior. That is, it is also necessary here to remove the trigger points in these muscles so that they can work fully, so that there is a full range of motion in these joints. First and foremost, between the first vertebra and the occipital bone. Here, as we can see, to reach these muscles, we can act on them. from the side of the spine, from the back surface. Here we have the rectus capitis anterior, with a posterior one underneath it. And in order to get to the oblique muscles of the head, we will have to approach more from the side surface here. But we need to take into account that all of this is still covered by the long neck flexor, and also covered by the posterior trapezius. How to affect the neck flexors? What to do with them during their spasm, their shortening? And how to balance long and short neck flexors. How to remove functional blocks between the first cervical vertebra, the second vertebra, and between the first cervical vertebra and the occipital bone. We will figure out all exercises for the neck flexors after we also thoroughly figure out the long neck flexors. Because it is necessary to deal with both deep and long neck flexors at the same time. Because there is no point in exercising these relatively small muscles and removing their shortening when your powerful long neck flexors are in poor condition. We'll talk about them next time. We'll also separately analyze each of them and see. If we previously just talked about the weakness, for example, of the long neck flexors, then now we'll look in detail at which muscles make up the long neck flexors and which of them are most often turned off, most often can be the cause of various pains, displacements of vertebrae. We'll go over all of this next time, and then together we'll go over detailed exercises for the long neck flexors, deep neck flexors, and how to act on them, including with a ball, as we did last time with the gluteal muscle. That'll be in another video.